So this right here is the brand new RTX 5070 Ti graphics card. It is the successor of the RTX 4070 Ti Super, and with an MSRP of $750, it is supposed to offer better performance and more features than its predecessor while costing less. Or at least in theory. And once again, we spent the last couple of days testing this card in 45 different games across 3 different resolutions. So let's see how it performs, how it compares to some other options on the market, and what can we expect from it. Let's begin. Since the RTX 5070 Ti Founders Edition doesn't exist, I was using this Ventus 3X OC model from MSI instead. This is supposed to be an MSRP card, but it actually looks and feels like a proper mid-range option. It has a metal frame, a metal backplate, and a plastic shroud around the fans, but the fans are actually a bit smaller, so this card is not as big as some more premium 3-fan cards on the market. And since this is a base price model, it doesn't have many extra features to talk about, like a dual BIOS, RGB, or extra connections, but you do get a simple GPU holder. On the back, you get the typical 3 DisplayPort 2.1 connections and a single HDMI 2.1B. The power comes from a single 12-volt 2x6 cable, and you do get an adapter for 2 regular 8-pin PCIe connections from your power supply. Spec-wise, it has the new Blackwell architecture, of course. The chip itself is the same size as on the RTX 5080 and the 4070 Ti Super, but it does have about 6% more CUDA, Tensor, and RT cores than its predecessor. Clock speeds are also a bit higher than on the last generation, and now you get 16 gigabytes of GDDR7 memory, which is a lot faster than the old GDDR6 memory. Now, just like the other 50 series cards, this is a PCIe Gen 5 card, and it is made on the same 4nm process as before, with its TDP being about 5% higher, so 300 watts, but I'm going to talk about power consumption a bit later in this video. So on paper, it is a small-ish upgrade from the 4070 Ti Super, while having an MSRP that is $50 lower. So in theory, you should be getting more for less. Now, for this video, I've tested and compared this RTX 5070 Ti to the Founders Edition of the 5090, 5080, the 4090, as well as the 4080 Super. And since there is no Founders Edition of the 4070 Ti Super, I use the Gigabyte Gaming OC model instead. From AMD, I have the 7900 XTX reference model, which should cost a bit more, and the 7900 XT Gaming OC, which should cost a bit less. What is important to keep in mind here is that the Gaming OC versions of the 4070 Ti Super and the 7900 XT are premium versions, and they perform a few percent faster than the cheapest options on the market. Now, all of these cards were tested on an AMD Ryzen 9800X 3D system, since that is the fastest gaming CPU that you can get at the moment. And as usual, if you want to know a bit more about the whole system that we were using for testing, or what our testing conditions are, I will leave all the details in the description box down below, and you can go ahead and check them out. Starting with Alan Wake 2 on high settings without ray tracing, the 5070 Ti has a bit of a disappointing start, being only a few frames faster than the 4070 Ti Super at 4K resolution. So it is just behind the 7900 XT and XTX, and a few frames behind the RTX 4080 Super as well. On 1440p, it is more or less the same situation, with only a marginal increase, and on 1080p, since Alan Wake is not actually CPU bound, we can see a small improvement as well. In Formula 1 2023, things are looking a bit more interesting, I would say. On 4K resolution, the 5070 Ti showed a meaningful improvement over the 4070 Ti Super, and it was even outperforming the RTX 4080 Super while beating both AMD cards easily. On 1440p, it is just behind the 4080 Super and ahead of AMD, while on 1080p resolution, it goes back to being just ahead of the 4080 Super yet again. So we're definitely looking at margin of error differences between the RTX 5070 Ti and the RTX 4080 Super in this game. If we look at Cyberpunk 2077 results, we can see a bigger improvement as well. On 4K resolution, it was nicely ahead of the 4070 Ti Super, and it just managed to get a frame ahead of the 4080 Super. At 1440p, there is a significant increase as well, ending up roughly on the same level as the 4080 Super and the RX 7900 XTX. While on 1080p resolution, we did run into a CPU bottleneck, so the improvement over the 4070 Ti Super is quite small and not really meaningful nor relevant. In Baldur's Gate 3 at 4K, it showed a nice improvement over the 4070 Ti Super yet again, but it ended up just a few frames behind the 4080 Super, though that was still enough to put it ahead of the fastest GPU from AMD. 1440p and 1080p resolutions are both starting to show CPU limitations, so while there are still some differences, they're small and not that relevant. Assassin's Creed Valhalla shows a smaller improvement overall, with the 5070 Ti falling in between the 4070 Ti Super and the 4080 Super, with a similar average FPS but better 1% lows compared to the RX 7900 XT. On low resolutions, the 5070 Ti is pretty similar to the 4070 Ti Super, even though we're clearly not CPU bottlenecked in this game. Starfield looks very similar to Valhalla and Alan Wake. There is not much of an improvement over the 4070 Ti Super at 4K resolution. At 1440p, we're not seeing any meaningful changes, and at 1080p resolution, it ended up just behind its predecessor. In Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, the RTX 5070 Ti ended up between the 4070 Ti Super and the 4080 Super once again, but that still puts it ahead of both AMD cards when looking at 4K resolution. At 1440p, it is only a little bit faster, roughly matching the XTX, and at 1080p resolution, it performs about the same as the old Ti Super and the 7900 XTX. In Remnant 2, the 5070 Ti just managed to outperform the 4080 Super at 4K resolution, even though the AMD looks a bit better in this game. It is pretty much the same at 1440p, with the 5070 Ti outperforming the 4080 Super and falling in between the XT and the XTX from AMD. On 1080p, the 5070 Ti, the 5080, 4080, 4070 Ti Super, and the XTX were all showing very similar results, which does point to a CPU limitation, but the 4090 and the 5090 did show better numbers, so it is a very interesting result. Now, as usual, I'm not going to talk about 45 different games individually, so let's look at some summaries instead, starting with 1080p resolution. Now, first of all, I don't think you should be buying a GPU in this class for 1080p gaming, but if you want to, the 5070 Ti will run everything easily. Only the Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024 had a bit of a disappointing result, but that game is really badly optimized and runs into CPU and GPU limitations very quickly. So if you like to play that game, I would enable DLSS and frame generation to get better results and a smoother gameplay. If you're gaming at 1440p resolution, the 5070 Ti will do great as well. Except for Flight Simulator 2024, there is not a single game that actually needs upscaling at this resolution, even for a higher refresh rate monitor, and even in heaviest of titles like Alan Wake 2 and Starfield. Now, I was personally pretty happy with the 4K performance of this card, with most games running 60 FPS or more natively, with only 3 of them dropping below 60 FPS average. Of course, some of those heavier titles were not really that much over 60, but with upscaling enabled, every single one of those games will easily run well, even on a high refresh rate 4K displays. And then with the new DLSS transformer model, the DLSS 4 performance mode actually looks better than the quality mode in previous DLSS generations, while running better. So with that, you can definitely say that this RTX 5070 Ti is a pretty capable 4K gaming GPU. And keep in mind that is with completely ignoring the frame generation feature, except in Flight Simulator 2024. Compared to the 4070 Ti Super, the 5070 Ti is between 2 and 26% faster depending on the game, but on average it is about 12% ahead. Now, considering it is going up against the slightly overclocked gaming OC version of the Ti Super, you could say that the gap between generations is more like closer to 15% instead of 12%. And as you go down in resolution, that gap does shrink a bit, and the difference between my two cards was about 8% on 1440p. If we compare it to the RTX 5080, the 5080 is about 18% faster on average, but it also costs 33% more on paper. So even though it is faster, it still makes the 5070 Ti look like a better deal overall, especially since the 5080 doesn't offer more VRAM either. The RTX 5070 Ti is now very close to the 4080 Super performance. The RTX 4080 Super is typically a little bit faster, but there are a couple of games where the 5070 Ti will match it or even outperform it. On average, the RTX 4080 Super is just a bit ahead, which means that the 5070 Ti very nicely matches the old 4080 non-Super when it comes to performance. Compared to AMD's fastest card, the 7900 XTX, the 5070 Ti is roughly at the same performance level. Some games favor Nvidia a bit more, while other games favor AMD, but in the 40+ games that we tested for this video, they actually ended up really close to each other, which puts the 5070 Ti about 12 to 13% ahead of the 7900 XT on average at 4K resolution. Again, some games will favor one card or the other, and sometimes by quite a big of a margin. So if you only care about one specific title, please do keep this in mind. With all these new RTX cards, you do get all the new features like DLSS 4 and multi-frame generation. Now, as I said in my previous videos, I don't agree with Nvidia that it is fair to present multi-frame generation data next to native FPS data and then somehow suggest that this new generation is way faster than before. But that being said, it is important to understand that frame generation is a very complex topic, and yes, it is not accurate to say that it is a purely straight-up performance boost, but it is also not accurate to call it terrible and useless because in some situations it can actually be really useful. Flight Simulator is a great example of this, and like I said before, this game is a bit of a mess and it performs really poorly on most cards and at most resolutions. But it is a slow-moving game where a small increase in latency will not matter at all. So if we take 4K native, we're only getting 30 FPS with pretty poor latency numbers. But with upscaling enabled and frame generation enabled, or multi-frame generation, we're actually getting a much better experience overall. Another example where DLSS 4 can work really well is Dragon Age the Veilguard on Ultra settings and with ray tracing set to Ultra as well. A native 4K will not give you a great experience. Just enabling upscaling is probably what I would do due to the lowest latency, but frame generation or multi-frame generation do offer another very reasonable way that you might want to play on. That being said, multi-frame generation cannot fix some of the heaviest path tracing titles, because for frame generation to work well, you do need to have a good start with a good frame rate from just using upscaling. And you really want the upscaling performance to be at least around 80-ish FPS to make it work well. So if we take Alan Wake 2, for example, in its fully path traced mode, it is just too heavy, and here, even though the frame generation FPS numbers look nice, the experience is not that great. In Star Wars Outlaws, with all ray tracing effects turned on, native performance is unplayable. With just upscaling enabled, it doesn't offer enough of performance either, in which case, turning frame generation on will not make the game feel better. The best way to play this game at 4K resolution is to just forget about the ray tracing settings. And the same can be said for Cyberpunk 2077. In its fully path-traced RT overdrive mode, the 5070 Ti is just not powerful enough. So while I do feel that the 5070 Ti can be a very good option for 4K gaming in general, if you really want to play all the latest and upcoming games in any full path tracing modes, you do want to get something that is a bit more powerful. Or you can consider this to be a 1440p card for any games with a full RT options, because if we look at Alan Wake 2, again, in its fully path trace mode, at 1440p, this card was handling it pretty well. So once again, the suggestion that the 5070 will be equal to a 4090 just doesn't make any sense, because even though the 5070 Ti with multi-frame generation will show higher frame rates than the RTX 4090, the actual experience with a 4090 in this situation is much better because of the higher base frame rate and lower latency. Now, for those of you that are interested in the creator side of things, there are some new decode and encode options available with this new generation, even though the 5070 Ti does not get a third encoder like the RTX 5090, nor the second decoder like the 5080 did. In the V-Ray RTX benchmark, the RTX 5070 Ti ended up slightly ahead of the RTX 4080 Super. But in Blender, it is actually a little bit slower than the RTX 4080 Super, and the increase over the 4070 Ti Super does vary per model. In this AI text generation benchmark using UL's new software, there's a nice improvement over the 4070 Ti Super, and it is actually ahead of the 4080 Super as well. As you can see, this is one area where Nvidia is considerably faster than comparable AMD products, both in terms of tokens per second and time to first token. If we look at the power consumption, this new generation is a little bit more complicated, I would say. Now, in the past, GPUs would typically use close to their maximum in most GPU limited scenarios, which would usually be around the claimed TDP. The 40 series already had some variations, but with the 50 series, there are significant differences depending on the game that you're playing. So the 5070 Ti can technically use up to 300 watts, but even in a GPU-heavy game, it would typically pull somewhere between 250 and 280 watts. Cyberpunk 2077 is one of the more power-hungry games, with this RTX 5070 Ti using 279 watts on average. So that is a couple of watts less than the 4070 Ti Super Gaming OC did, and significantly less than the 7900 XT Gaming OC. So in terms of power supply advice, I would say the same as I did for the RTX 4070 Ti Super. So a good quality 650 watt power supply should be enough if you don't have a really power-hungry CPU, but I would aim for a nice 750 watt model with a CPU like I was using for this video, or an 850 watt model if you plan to pair it with a really power-hungry processor. If you're curious about the thermal and noise performance of this card, I'm already working on a roundup where I'll be comparing several 5070 Ti models, but those cards are still under NDA, so I cannot say too much about it at the moment. But this MSI Ventus model does show good temperatures and a reasonable noise level. Larger cards will probably end up being a bit quieter, but I think 40 decibels is the sort of noise level that shouldn't really bother most people. So it is safe to say that MSRP models like this one will end up being the best value 5070 Ti to look for. So if we look at the numbers, the 5070 Ti is about 12% faster than the overclocked 4070 Ti Super that I tested, so about 15-ish% faster than an MSRP 4070 Ti Super at a slightly reduced price. But I think the best way to summarize this card is to say that it offers an RTX 4080 level of performance at a lower power draw, a much lower price, and with lots of new and useful features. And I know that some of you probably expected more, and it definitely doesn't help that Nvidia was spreading these unrealistic expectations that a 5070 will offer the 4090 level of performance, because now some people will be just disappointed, while in reality, having the RTX 4080 level of performance is a great place to be for this card, for both 1440p and for 4K gaming. So the 5070 Ti is also head-to-head with the 7900 XTX in terms of raw performance, and then if you're going to game at 4K resolution, the improvements to DLSS alone should be enough to go for Nvidia. So if you already own a 4070 Ti Super, it's not really worth upgrading it to this card. But if you have an older GPU, this new generation makes a lot more sense than the 40 series, assuming you can get these cards and that some of them will be available for the recommended price that Nvidia has set. Just keep in mind that it shouldn't be much more expensive than the RTX 4070 Ti Super nor the RTX 4080 Super, because I do expect that these cards will sell out very quickly before the supply and prices properly stabilize over time. So if you are waiting to upgrade your older card, trying to get an MSRP model when they start selling tomorrow is not a bad plan. But if that doesn't work, just be patient and wait for things to normalize a bit, and please do not overpay for these mid-range cards. Now that is all I have for today, but before I go, let's check out the sponsor of this video. This video is brought to you by Corsair and their brand new gaming monitor, the Xeneon 34WQHD 240C. This beautifully designed monitor comes with a top-of-the-line 34-inch QD OLED panel with a subtle 1800R curve, an ultra-wide Quad HD resolution, 240Hz refresh rate, instant response times, and a near-perfect color reproduction, making it a great option for anything from fast-paced games to immersion games, from content consumption to content creation. And if you're worried about possible burn-in that is inherent to all OLED panels, Corsair has you covered with a 3-year-long warranty that includes burn-in. So if you're looking for a new high-end ultra-wide, please do check out the link in the description below. Thank you all for watching and staying to the very end. I hope this video was helpful enough. I'm also preparing a nice comparison of a couple of partner cards that I managed to get my hands on. So if you want to see that video, please do consider clicking that subscribe button so you never miss my future uploads. Bye guys, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!